and I'm seeing if I'm on. Okay, that sounds like it's right. Okay. And so we're taking a little break before we jump into Micah, looking at a very famous and popular passage of David and Goliath. I was thinking about how many of the stories are the ands. You know, there's Jonah and the whale, David and Daniel and the lion's den. There's David and Goliath. And the reason I picked this is because oftentimes these popular stories are misunderstood because they're so popular. We've heard they've been appropriated and they've been embellished upon and they've been taken in ways that wasn't the intent of the original author. For instance, think of Noah and the ark. There's another and we think of the giraffes sticking out of the cute little boat and the elephants and the lions, and they're all happy together. Noah's ark, Noah and the flood, is not about cute animals. That's way down on the tier of what the passage is about. It's about, one, the judgment of the wicked that God will send upon the earth, and two, that God will preserve his people through the judgment so that it does not touch them. But we've put it on nursery walls and everything, which is really a weird thing to think about, this mural of judgment in nursery places, just because there's cute animals. Well, David and Goliath is another one of those stories that has been taken and extrapolated and misunderstood. And so this passage, just a long passage, what we're going to do is we're going to take it section by section, and we're going to see what's going on in the text, and then, there's only 2 points to this. The next point, we're going to see what is this passage actually talking about. So, let's begin in verses 1 through 11 is our first section. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle." So, of course, Israel itself is in war with Philistines in the Promised Land. "And they were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, the encampment between Soka and Azekah in Ephes-Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span." Now, let's stop there for a second. There's been a lot of debates and a lot of discourse around Goliath's height, which, interestingly, is not really even the point of this passage either. However, what's also interesting is that everyone refers to Goliath as a giant. This passage actually never refers to him as a giant. It uses the word champion, which is one that is mighty in battle, trained for war as a young age. Now, if we're going to break this down, though, a cubit is about 18 inches, and a span is about 9 inches, which would be 9 feet 9 inches. The tallest man in the modern history died in 1940, and he was 8'11 inches, which is only about a 10-inch difference. So this isn't outside the realm of a possibility. It doesn't have to be a supernatural height for someone to reach this kind of level. There are some textual variants out there that would say 4 cubits in a span, which would be about 6'9". Now, that doesn't seem very big to us. However, the average height of this day was 5'5", and so any kind of height was going to be big in their eyes. There is another factor in that we need to be careful not to use modern specificity for ancient measures of units. And what I say by that is, they didn't have an actual ruler. What was a cubit? The cubit was the tip of the finger to the elbow. Well, my cubit and Pastor Skip's cubit are 2 different kinds of cubits. It was a roundabout kind of number. What's a span? Well, a span is if you spread out your fingers, you measure from this, your thumb to your pinky, well, that measurement is a span. And so it's a roundabout general idea of how high he was, not a specific kind of hill we need to die on of what his height was. The point is, he was big. It calls him a champion, and that's the point. Now, why does this matter in a battle? Well, if he can reach you, and you with your little 5'5" arms can't reach him, he has an absolute clear advantage over you because he can injure you and you can't injure him back. The point is that he is a fierce warrior. Height means reach, and if you can't reach your opponents with the weapons, then he has a clear advantage. So, Goliath was a big man. He was a big man that was imposing. We continue on, verse 5. And he held a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, and he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. All right, so let's do some more weights and measures. He has a helmet of bronze, the heavy armor on his chest, and greaves on his legs. So he's a well-armored man. Forged metals was superior to the Stone Age weapons that a lot of these people had, of stone spears and that sort of thing. The weight of this armor, if you take these ancient measures, was about 150 pounds. So this was heavy armor that he was wearing. This was not armor that a person would wear all the time. This isn't, think of knights in the Middle Ages riding on horses. It's not that kind of armor. This kind of armor is something you specifically put on right before the battle, and when the battle's over, you take it off. In fact, that was the very purpose for having a shield bearer. That was his entire job, helping Goliath don the armor and then doffing it after the battle was over. Their job was to literally haul around their superior's armor from place to place where they traveled before battle. The reason the shield bearer went before him, it says, was kind of like a golf caddy. You know how golf caddies carry the clubs for the actual golfer? Well, he carried all the heavy stuff so that the champion wasn't weighed down with unneeded gear, but could also transition. So he was going to primarily fight with his spear. The sword was there as a backup. And if he needed his shield, well, his sword bearer was there to toss that into the battle ring so that he could take that up as well. He also had weapons, Goliath did. Across his back was a bronze javelin. The javelin is a throwing weapon, so a ranged weapon to kind of reach whoever that person was if they were trying to stay away from him. He also had a spear, which was the primary weapon of a warrior at this time, not the sword. The spear had the advantage that you could jab from far away while they couldn't get to you. You would have to get around the spear somehow in order to finally get to your opponent. Considering Goliath already had natural reach, he was already a big man with far reach, the spear added another element of lethality and danger to whoever fought against him. It means Goliath was untouchable. You couldn't get to the guy, but he could easily attack you and kill you. It was a thick, heavy spear with a metal head that the metal head alone would weigh about 15 pounds. So a 15-pound jab in the gut from a spear isn't a good way to go. He also had a sword by his side, which was used for personal defense. So if you got around the spear somehow, you deflected or parried the spear, well, then he could go for the sword, which was close quarters, and then he could kill you that way. So he has all the equipment. He has all the training. He has all the height and physical ability. This is not someone you want to mess with. In fact, I'm sure that Goliath, as we'll see later, is itching at the bit, wanting to use his martial prowess in order to slay and kill some kind of Israelite. So, continuing in verse 8. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, you shall be our servants and serve us." So Goliath, this champion, this warrior, armed for battle, sets up an ultimatum. Each person, each side, those of the covenant people of God and those that are pagan God-haters, are to set up a champion representative for their people. And they are to battle against one another. And whoever wins has the right to make the other into slaves. Now this may seem odd to us. Why wouldn't you just fight a normal battle? Why would you come to some kind of agreement? Well, rather than hundreds or thousands dying in a war, what if we had potentially only one guy had to die in a war, and we could settle this conflict here? And so this is what he's proposing. Rather than us going and having bloody bloodshed, well, one fights against one, that'll settle the matter. Verse number 10, and the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." When Saul and all of Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So he doesn't just say, I want an ultimatum. He defies Israel. He mocks them. He goads them into challenging him. He questions their legitimacy and their prowess and who they were. The response of God's people isn't in anger, isn't hostility. It's fear. They were dismayed. We can't possibly beat this guy. Saul and all the covenant people of God heard this, and the reaction was fearfulness. Even their so-called King Saul, who should have been a defender and representative of the people to stand up against someone like Goliath, was terrified and refused to fight Goliath. In fact, one of the reasons the people first liked Saul in the beginning was because he was tall. 1 Samuel 9:2 says he was a head taller than everybody else, and so that's why the people were so enamored with him. Well, he was tall, but Goliath was bigger. Goliath was badder. In the face of real problems, the worldly standards that people have, and the things that we think are going to help us often fall up short, just as Saul did in this situation. We look to money and pleasure and people and things to get us through, but they can't help when the real issues of eternity, spirituality, and life meaning are really at play. Now, verse 12, David. Now, David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. And in the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. That's Jesse. He was already an old man. And the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Aminadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul. Now we hear of David, who is the youngest in a family of 8 brothers. Jesse was already old when David was born, and kings, who David will one day become, aren't usually chosen by the youngest. So you have an old man who is his father, and also he was the youngest of 8. This is an odd birth. It's a peculiar situation. So David had an unusual birth from what he would become, a king later on, a birth in Bethlehem of the tribe of Judah. Jesse's other sons had gone off to war. So David, the youngest, stayed behind and tended sheep. That was his job. He was a shepherd. But he would go back and forth and give supplies to his brothers, then coming back and tending the sheep. Verse number 16. So back to the battlefield. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. And Jesse said to David his son, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them to the camp to your brothers. And also take these 10 cheeses to the commanders of their thousands. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them." So, for twice a day, morning and evening, for 40 days, Goliath came out with his same speech, trying to goad the people of Israel to send a champion to fight him. The enemy of God's people would mock and taunt them into battle with him that he was sure to win. David, in contrast to defying God and defying authority, David obeyed his father. His father said, "Go." Him, in obedience, left his home to obey his father's word and give nourishment and care to his brothers. He took with him grain and 10 loaves as a care package to his soldier brothers at the front lines. He also took 10 cheeses. I like cheeses. Those are good. Now, why did he take those cheeses? Not to give to his brother, but to give specifically to the brother's commander, their commander of thousands, meaning their company commander, the person that they were in charge of. Why would he bring them cheeses? Well, company commanders get to choose who he positions where. And so Jesse was possibly trying to find some kind of favor in the eyes of the company commander so that his children won't be the ones on the very front rung of the ranks and then end up getting killed. So in verse 20, we have, "And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep, and a keeper took the provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to battle to the battle line, shouting the war cry. So David woke up early after this. Jesse commanded him. He didn't lollygag. He was early to go and early to obey exactly what his father had told him to do. And when David finally gets there to go to the battle assembly, is already gathering. They're already preparing for this daily ritual of Goliath coming out and taunting God's people. David left the gifts and hurried to see the daily mocking ritual that Goliath was to perform. Goliath gave his rant of superiority, and then it continues on. We're in verse 21. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. And as he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. So, David left the gifts, hurried down to see what would happen. Goliath gave his rant of superiority, and it says in verse 23, David heard him. Something clicked in the ears of David. But notice in verse 24, what does it say? All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. Everyone else saw. David heard. What they saw was the imposing nature and well-armored Goliath of Gath, and they were afraid of what they saw. David, however, didn't care about the stature of the man. He cared about the words coming out of his mouth. That was the thing that was offensive to him, not merely the size of the warrior. Verse 25, and the men of Israel said, have you seen this man? Once again, they saw who has come up. Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. The others were scared, and yet kind of enticed in their terror, if they could just be man enough to go against Goliath of Gath and get riches, position, and the king's very own daughter in marriage. Well, what does David care about? Verse 26, and David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done to the man who kills the Philistines and takes away the reproach from Israel? That's what David heard, and that's what David is upset about. Not the riches, not the daughter, not the position, reproaching God's people. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Meaning, he's not part of the kingdom, the people of God. He's outside of the covenant of God. That he should defy the armies of the living God. And the people answered in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. David didn't care about any of the rewards that he was going to get potentially from this endeavor. Rather, he was enamored, fixated on the blasphemy coming out of Goliath's mouth, and he could not let that stand because it was an affront not only to the people of Israel, but to the living God, the one true God that actually exists. To put it in modern terms, David was triggered. Why? Because this brought reproach upon the people of God as cowards. Because it was done by an uncircumcised pagan who was not part of God's covenant people, and because it was defying the one true and living God of the universe. So we come to verse 28. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption, and that evil is in your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. So this is now a reaction from Eliab, his oldest brother. Seeing David's zeal angers Eliab. Eliab's anger isn't kindled against Goliath and the blasphemy he's saying. He's mad at David for being bold enough to say that we should stand up against him. The only emotion that Eliab has for Goliath is fear. His anger against David, his own brother, because David dares to say something should be done about this. This shouldn't be left to stand. And so what does Eliab do? Well, he demotes him. go back to your few sheep in the wilderness. You don't know what you're talking about. The only reason you came down here is because you have a bloodlust and you want to see people die in battle. That's it. Shut up, David. Go home. Verse 29. David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another, and he spoke in the same way. Okay, fine. Eliab, what about you guys? You think something should be done about this? And the people answered him again as before. And the words that David spoke were heard, and repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. Who's this guy, this boy, this kid, who's saying someone actually needs to go fight Goliath? Bring him to the king. Verse 32. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him, because of Goliath. Your servant, that's me, will go and fight with this Philistine. David wasn't just a vain talker. Some people like to talk big, but David put his money where his mouth was. Some people hide behind, well, someone should do something about that, never intending to do it themselves, skirting any kind of personal responsibility. David says, look, don't let anyone be scared. I'll go fight that guy. If no one else is going to, I'll do it. So, verse 33, and Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. Saul's reply is that, David, you're too young to do this. You're too short in stature, you're too young, you're too inexperienced. That when Goliath was your age, David, he was training for battle. He's chomping at the bit in order to go fight, and he was bred as a child soldier to do this very thing. He's bigger, he's better equipped, and he has far more training than you, little shepherd boy. So verse 34, but David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep with his father, and struck him, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, and I struck him and delivered him out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, the Lord be with you. David is undeterred at Saul's dismissal of his claims. But notice here, rather than looking at himself, David isn't saying, look, Saul, I'm a really great warrior. I can do this. Just, I believe in myself. You believe in me too. That's not what David says. He's also not looking at Goliath. He's not saying, oh, look how big and scary he is, and he's so fearsome. David's eyes isn't on himself. David's eyes isn't on the enemy. David's eyes are on God. That's who he looks to. Yes, he mentions how he killed a lion and he killed a bear. Why? Because the Lord delivered him from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear. And he looks at the promises of God, of what he did in the past, and said, just as he did that back then, he'll do it now with this Philistine guy. God's past work is evidence that he still works in the present. When you have doubt, when you have fears, when those enemies are coming around you, simply look to what God has already done for you throughout all of your life and use that as encouragement that he will get you through. So in verse 38, then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail, and David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Saul isn't willing to go himself, even though he's the king and should stand as the representative of Israel. No one else is willing to go, so fine, Saul says. David, go ahead. Try it out. Saul thinks, however, too conventionally. Okay, if Goliath has a bunch of armor and a bunch of weapons, I'll give you, David, my best armor and weapons. He was the king. He had the best gear. I'll give that to you so you can go toe-to-toe in exactly the same way with Goliath, which if he did that was sure death. As King Saul had the best armor, he was also a tall man. And so it didn't fit David when he put it in. He couldn't move. He wasn't mobile in it. It was too big, too heavy. You see, trusting in these natural means of just weapons and armor were a sure cause that David would die rather than victory, and trusting in the Lord. So in verse 40, then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. So what did David rely on rather than armor or even having a sword? He doesn't have any kind of piercing weapon whatsoever. The same things God used to deliver him in the past. His shepherd's staff and his sling. He took his shepherd gear with him into battle, a staff and 5 smooth stones. Verse 41, and the Philistine moved forward and came near to David and his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. So Goliath pulls up for his daily taunting session, just as he did before, takes one look at David and laughs at him. He disdains him. He laughs him off as irrelevant, as this young man comes out to him with what? A staff and a sling? He's got no armor. He's got no prowess. Like Goliath, David is just a dog to be shooed away with a stick. Goliath calls upon his false gods to curse David. And Goliath, wanting to show how strong he was in battle, that he trained for since he was a young boy, gives David a final warning. If you do this, boy, I'm going to kill you, and your flesh is going to go to wild beasts. Verse 45, David responds, and David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, and the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with spear and sword, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. David's undeterred. Calls Goliath out. He said his sword and spear and javelin, he acknowledges their existence, but they're nothing in comparison to something far mightier. The Lord of hosts is at his side. The very God that Goliath mocked and defied is the very God who will destroy Goliath. That God will have you killed, and David says, I'm the one who will do it, and I'm going to cut off your head. Now, what tools did David have to cut off Goliath's head? None. He had no sword. He had a staff. You can't cut off a head with that. And he had a sling. You can't cut off a head with that. David had faith that God would provide the very means to end Goliath's life that he needed. He didn't currently have those means in his hands. He didn't have it in his sight, but it didn't matter. His faith was bigger than the current circumstance. David turns Goliath's insult back to him, that his body will be given over to rot among the wild animals, but not only Goliath's, he says many Philistines. Okay, you say my body's going to rot? I'll make you and a bunch of your people rot out in the wilderness. So, this is so that everyone, he says, will know that there is a God in Israel. This is so that both the pagan Philistines and even the cowering people of God will know that there is a God in Israel. He turns back in a motion to the assembly behind him. Assembly, interestingly enough, if you translate it, same word as church. So that this church will know that the Lord doesn't save with swords and spears and human means, but with God's own might. David isn't boastful. He points to God, and he is the one who will defeat him. So, verse 48. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David and his rebuttal angered Goliath, and Goliath rushed out past the battle line to meet David. And what is David's response? Well, he rushes towards Goliath. This is epic movie stuff here. David in bravery rushes out just as quickly to meet Goliath head-on in mortal combat. And while he was running, he reaches into his pouch, readied his sling, and shot it right into Goliath's head, making him tumble and fall to the ground. All that bluster for 40 days, all the bragging, all the fear, all the worry, the actual fight was over in seconds. Done. Finished. Over. So, verse 50. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. David, you see, had a promise to keep. His promise to Goliath was he was going to cut off his head. So, you don't need to carry your own sword if you can take your enemy's sword right off of his body. David took the very instrument that Goliath wanted for his death and used it against him to decapitate him. He destroyed the enemy's head with his own instrument of death. The reaction from the rest of the Philistines? They fled. They're out of here. I don't want any of that. Obviously, the deal, remember the deal? Well, if you defeat us, we'll be slaves. That wasn't a real deal. Because they didn't say, okay, we're your slaves now. It was all based on a lie, and they were scared, and so they ran away from the people of God. Verse 42, what did the people of God do? And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way to Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. So what was the reaction of God's people? They shouted. They had their bravery back. They had their courage back because of what David did, and they pursued after the enemy. The chief enemy was defeated, and so they were moved to action, and they themselves went and fought the rest of the battle. They chased the Philistines, they slew them, and they plundered the camps of the enemies. Verse 54. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out amongst the Philistines, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, Inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. So, while they're out pillaging and killing the Philistines, David goes back to Saul and plops Goliath's head on his table. Saul then takes notice, asking, Whose father is this Savior of our people? Who is this person that stood as a representative of God's people against their enemy? His lineage was called into question, but the answer given is that he's the son of Jesse from Bethlehem. What I find interesting about this is that if you read this passage, God is mentioned 4 times in this passage. Lord, or Yahweh, is mentioned 5 times in this passage. by David. All those times by David. The only other time, once, is by Saul's reaction to David when he mentions the Lord. No one else in this passage is talking about God. All they see is Goliath. All they see is the danger in their way. All they see is the mighty warrior standing and blaspheming God that they're afraid of. They don't see the Lord God as bigger than any giant could possibly be. But David does. So, what is this story about? What's the meaning of this? You see, when we read about this, it's not just a neat Sunday school story. It's part of what's called redemptive history. That this is leading up to the son of David, the Messiah. This story has been warped and changed into facing football teams that are bigger than you, that is, facing a boss that is unruly, facing personal giants in your life. This story is not about facing your giants. It's that Jesus faces your giants for you. He is the one that defends us. It's about things bigger than things that we can handle. And what did he defeat? Well, he defeated death, hell, and sin, and the grip of Satan on this world. Go ahead and go to that next slide. You see, who are you in this story? You're not David. You're the covenant people of God standing behind David, unable to do anything, unwilling to do anything, cowering before this mighty enemy that you cannot defeat on yourselves. This is Jesus stepping in as the representative and savior of God's people to fight a battle that you can't fight on your own. And how do we see that? Well, let's go back through this passage quickly, and we're almost done. Verse 9, what did we see? We saw a wicked champion against God's people who wanted to enslave God's people in wickedness and in terror. In verse 10, what happens? The people are afraid, and even what they previously trusted in, their previous law keeping, their previous understanding of God, their past legal king, Saul, could not give them freedom. The old administration of Saul could not be a savior for God's people. And so what does it take? Verse number 13. It takes David from the tribe of Judah, born in Bethlehem, to be the savior of the people. In fact, he has an unusual birth. He's the youngest of a very old man. Verse 15. He is the shepherd. He is the one that keeps the sheep. Jesus is the chief shepherd of our souls. And it is no coincidence that the first people who hear and see the incarnate Christ, the proclamation of the coming of the Messiah. Who were they? Shepherds. Shepherds where? On the hillside of Bethlehem. Those very same hills that David himself, 1,000 years earlier, tended sheep, is where now his later son in lineage is proclaimed to be the Messiah, greater than David ever was. Jesus himself had that unusual birth. Jesus himself freed us from an enslavement of a champion. Verse number 16, 40 days Goliath taunted the people of God. This mirrors the 40 days and nights of Noah through the great flood, the 40 days and nights of fasting by Moses before the law was given, and the trials of God's people for 40 years and wandering in the wilderness until the promised land, and the 40 days of temptation and fasting of Jesus himself in the wilderness. Jesus, you see, has entered into the existence and experience of God's people, reliving, recapitulating everything they went through so that he could be the final sacrifice that could atone for their sins. Hebrews 2:14 says, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook the same things." He lived in our existence. "And through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery." What did Goliath threaten? He threatened to enslave the people of God. Jesus here in Hebrews 2 destroyed the devil, destroyed the means of death by taking on and experiencing the life of humanity and his people. In verse 17 of this passage, David was sent by his father Jesse to his people to give them nourishment. Jesus himself perfectly obeyed his heavenly Father and left the glories of the heavenly realm to come and be incarnate among his people, us, to give us nourishment and to give us life, that he is the very bread of life. 1 John 3:8, it says this, the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. That's why he came down. He obeyed his Father. And in verse 20, just as David left his home of comfort and security with the Father, and yet when he arrived, what happened to David? He was rejected by his own people. He was mocked by his own people, just as Jesus was of the people of Israel. The reward was riches and Saul's daughter and freedom based on national interests. David rather saw the reward as taking away the reproach of the people from an unbelieving pagan outside of the covenant who defied the people of the living God and thus God himself. That is exactly what Jesus came to settle and to score, not with local national interests of kicking out Romans, but rather by defeating the large enemy of sin and death and hell and Satan. Verse 28, David faced opposition by his own people and his own family, which also led to Jesus Christ and his crucifixion. Verse 37, this is interesting. He calls upon the Lord who saved me out of the paw of the lion and the bear. Who is that Lord that David is referring to? The very Lord, capital L-O-R-D, that David is referring to as delivering him is none other than the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ himself. So Jesus pre-existed David, saved him during David's lifetime from bears and lions, and later from Goliath, and then from the lineage of David, Jesus himself was incarnate and came. How can I say that? Well, because the New Testament says this as was David when he spoke of Jesus. Listen to this in Luke 20, verse 41. But he said to them, how can they say that the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. David thus calls him Lord. How is he his son? How is he the son of David and the Lord of David? Well, Jesus Christ, the incarnate, that's why. Revelation 22:16, I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you about these things in the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright and the morning star. Where did David get his start? The root of him is Jesus. And he's also the descendant of that very David. He is both. He's the greater David that stands for his people as a representative. Verse 38. They tried to get David to fight in earthly means by putting on the armor of Saul. And that made sense to them, just like kicking out the Romans made sense to the disciples, but Jesus had a bigger mission. Verse 50, the very thing Goliath wanted to kill David with was his sword. David used that very sword to cut off his head. Jesus himself is prophesied to destroy the head of the serpent in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Satan wanted to use an instrument of torture. The cross. Can you think of what a cross is? We've sanitized the cross into pretty kind of things. It was directly made by Romans to inflict the most pain possible. This instrument of torture and death. Satan wanted to use this to defeat Jesus, but on the cross, Jesus used that very thing to defeat death, hell, and the grave. He used Satan's own weapon against him to secure victory. And what did David do? He didn't just stab him in the heart. He cut off his head, just as Jesus is prophesied to destroy the head of the serpent. Colossians 2:7, he disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in them. Verse 52, what happened to the people of God after this happened? They were motivated. And this is where you come in. The people of God were moved to action because of what David did. And we as the people of God should be moved to action because of what Jesus has done for us. He has destroyed sin, hell, the devil, the sting of death. He has won the war for us, therefore we can fight the battles. Jesus is the one that moves first. And that gives us bravery to then go after the remaining enemies of God. This is not a call to inaction. Rather, it is understanding that Jesus, as our representative, has beaten the war for us. Therefore, we can have bravery in marching forward. In most conflicts in this world, you fight battles in order to win the greater war. Christ, just like David, flips that on his head. He wins the war so that we can then go fight the minor battles. Goliath thought this fight meant certain doom to David, just as Satan thought it was doom to Jesus. Think about how odd it is that instrument of Roman torture, which was designed to purely inflict maximum pain and shame, was transformed into a symbol of beauty and love. When we look at the cross now, it doesn't have those old symbols. It has the symbols of God's forgiveness and grace. The cross is a symbol of what Jesus is going to do for the entire universe. He's going to transform every pain into beauty and every shame into love. In verse 55, the people questioned whose son David was, just as they questioned Jesus as the Son of God. We'll close with this. In 1 Corinthians 15:25, it says, "The last enemy to be destroyed is death." And go to that next slide. 1 Corinthians 15:54. "Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through Jesus Christ our Lord." We have the victory because Jesus already won it. And God gives us that victory freely through his Son, Jesus Christ, better than David, standing as our representative against enemies that we could not defeat. But it doesn't stop there. Verse 58, "Therefore, because of that, because you know that, my beloved brothers, what should you do? Well, just like the people of God and David, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." What you do matters. Because Jesus won the victory for us, we should then be steadfast, immovable, and abounding in love. Beloved, the story of David and Goliath isn't that we go out in our own strength to fight our Goliaths. It's that Jesus fought our Goliaths for us. He destroyed our enemies for us. And now we, as the people of God, march against the remaining enemies, knowing that victory is already secured. There is no way, it is impossible, for the people of God to lose this thing. Did you know that? As much as we might, if I had hair to tear our hair out about elections and everything else, it's impossible for the church of the living God to lose this. Why? Not the election, the universe, the new heavens and the new earth. Because Jesus already won. The powers of God are simply flailing. Jesus is victorious, and that means we are already victorious. Church, march forward bravely in the victory that Christ has secured. At this time, Pastor Skip is going to come and lead us in reflection based on what we've heard.